The first time the townspeople saw them together, no one spoke. They didn't have to. The silence carried a weight far heavier than words could bear. A boy, no more than 19, and a woman twice his age, walking arm in arm through the cracked streets of a fading Midwestern town. She wore white. Not the bright, celebratory white of youth, but the pale, worn shade that had weathered years of dust and grief. He looked like he was trying to stand taller than his body would allow, as if defiance could hide the truth that every whisper in town already knew. They were not just mother and son. They were about to become something far more forbidden. You have to understand, this was no modern scandal. This was the sort of union America pretends never existed, the kind that hides in the footnotes of dusty archives, mentioned only in court transcripts and whispered testimonies that historians are too polite or too afraid to read aloud. The kind of story that forces you to question where love ends and where something darker begins. Her name had been erased from most public records, replaced only with a single initial. His name, when it did appear, was often misspelled, as though history itself refused to fully acknowledge him. Yet, the more I dug, the clearer the picture became. Two lives bound together not by chance, but by a pattern of loss and dependence so suffocating, it eventually twisted into something no one could unsee. People still talk about how the invitations were sent out. Not through the church, not in the newspaper, but slipped quietly under doors, sealed with no return address. No flowers, no music, no pastor. Just a courthouse room, empty except for the two of them, and a clerk who kept his eyes fixed firmly on the paperwork, never once looking up. What drives a mother to see her son not as a child, but as a partner, and what keeps a son from running wild? When that line is crossed, these are questions without easy answers, but if you stay with me, I'll take you to the roots of it, back before the wedding, before the rumors, to a home where love was never just love, and family was never just family. They lived on the edge of town, in a house that seemed to lean away from the road, as if ashamed to be seen. The paint had peeled away long before the boy was born, leaving the wood beneath bare and grey, exposed to every winter storm. Inside, the air always carried a faint smell of damp earth and kerosene, like the walls themselves had absorbed decades of unspoken things. The father was gone before the boy could speak his first words. No one agreed on how he left. Some claimed he died working the mines. Others whispered that he ran off with a younger woman. His absence wasn't marked with grief so much as with a hollow quiet, the kind that settles over a place when something essential has been taken away. The mother never remarried. Instead, she turned inward, pouring all of herself into the boy in ways that went beyond simple care. Neighbors noticed early on how inseparable they were. She never let him play with other children, claiming the world outside was cruel, that friends would only betray him. When the boy turned 12, she stopped letting him sleep in his own room, saying the house was too cold, that it was safer to keep him close. He stopped growing outward toward the world and began curling inward toward her. By the time he was 17, the lines between them had blurred beyond recognition. If he was seen in town, she was always beside him, her hand on his arm, her voice answering questions for him. They shared the same expressions, the same quiet way of looking at people as though measuring their intentions. The town began to talk, but the mother seemed immune to shame. Then came the illness. It started with coughing fits, long nights where the boy sat at her bedside holding her hand, afraid to sleep in case she didn't wake. For months, he fed her, bathed her, read to her from the Bible in a voice that shook with something more than fear. When she recovered, she told people, though no one asked, that he had saved her life. And in a way he had. But it wasn't the kind of saving that sets someone free. It was the kind that binds them tighter, until escape is no longer possible. When the wedding was first whispered about, most dismissed it as a cruel joke. Small towns have a way of inventing their own monsters when the nights get too long, and this sounded like one of them. But the truth has a way of pushing itself through the cracks, and soon the details began to collect like dust in corners no one bothered to sweep. It was said the boy, now a man by law but still with a softness in his face, had never once been seen courting any of the local girls. No dances, no strolls along the river, no late-night drives in borrowed cars. Instead, his evenings were spent at home, helping his mother with chores, fixing what little needed fixing in a house that had been falling apart for years. To some, this was admirable, the mark of a dutiful son. To others, it was the first sign that something had taken root long ago. The day they went to the courthouse, the clerk remembered the way she signed her name with a steady hand, as if there was nothing unusual about the moment. She didn't wear a veil, didn't bother with flowers or a dress made for the occasion, just her Sunday best, pressed neatly, and an expression that dared anyone to question her. He stood beside her like a shadow, not nervous, not smiling, simply present. When the papers were filed, they walked out together without looking back. Some say they went straight home. Others swear they saw them stop at the diner on Main Street, sitting in the same booth they'd always shared, ordering coffee like it was any other day. But those who claim to have seen them there never agree on whether they held hands across the table. What made it legal was a loophole, a jurisdictional blind spot that turned what should have been a crime into a matter of paperwork. The state recognized no barrier if both parties were consenting adults, no matter the bloodline, and so, by the letter of the law, nothing could be done. But legality is not the same as acceptance. For months afterward, neighbors would cross the street when they saw them coming. The preacher at the church began delivering sermons about unnatural bonds without speaking their names, his voice rising until the rafters seemed ready to splinter. And yet they walked on, side by side, as if they were the only two people left in the world. To understand how it came to this, you have to go further back, before the boy was born, before the father's shadow disappeared from the doorway. Her childhood was marked by the kind of neglect that doesn't leave bruises, but carves itself deep into the bones. She was the youngest of 5, born into a family where affection was rationed like bread during a famine. Her mother worked the fields. Her father drank his wages in the corner booth of the local bar. She learned early that if she wanted to be noticed, she had to be indispensable. She became the caretaker of younger nieces and nephews while still a child herself, a skill that was both survival and prison. By the time she reached womanhood, she had already practiced being a mother far more than being a daughter. So when the boy came into her life, she didn't just love him. She built her entire existence around him. There were stories from those early years that the boy himself might not have remembered, but others did. The way she would feed him from her own plate even when food was scarce, keeping nothing for herself. The way she'd stroke his hair when he was sick, singing old hymns in a voice so low it felt almost like a whisper meant only for him. By the time he was 10, he was already repeating her words back to her, about how no one in the world would ever love him the way she did, how the two of them would always be together, no matter what anyone else thought. That kind of vow, once planted in a child's mind, doesn't fade easily, and maybe to her it wasn't about romance at all, at least not in the beginning. Maybe it was about ownership, the only kind of possession she'd ever known. But ownership has a way of mutating into desire, and desire, once it crosses the wrong line, doesn't retreat. By the time the boy reached manhood, their lives had woven together so tightly that pulling them apart would have been like tearing the skin from bone, and in a place where the outside world rarely came knocking, there was no one to tell them or force them to stop. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? After the wedding, the house became even quieter than before. No visitors came by, no family wrote letters. It was as though the rest of the world had agreed, without speaking, to erase them. The only sounds were the creak of floorboards and the distant hum of the highway, a reminder that life elsewhere moved on without them. Inside, their routines became ritual. Morning coffee at the kitchen table, her hand lingering too long on his. Afternoons spent tending the small garden in back, speaking in low voices as though they shared a secret too fragile to name. At night, the lamps burned late, their glow seeping out through the thin curtains, a silent signal to those passing by that they were awake, together, in ways the town no longer wanted to imagine. But the thing about isolation is that it distorts time. Days blend, years vanish, and the outside world becomes a rumor. He began looking older than his age, not from hardship, but from the stillness of a life without change. She, on the other hand, seemed almost untouched by the years, as if the very act of keeping him close had preserved her. There was one story, told only once and only after too much whiskey, from a former neighbor who had moved away years earlier. She claimed that, on a summer evening not long after the wedding, she passed their house and saw them dancing in the kitchen. No music, no laughter, just the two of them moving slowly, eyes locked, as if they were the last people left alive. Whether that was true or not hardly matters. What mattered was the feeling it left behind, that this was no longer about survival or even defiance. This was about creating a world where no one else could enter, a world bound by blood and sealed by choice. In that world, love and control were the same thing. And once you live inside that for long enough, you stop asking whether it's right or wrong. You simply forget there was ever another way to live. It didn't last forever. Stories like this never do. Age, the one thing they couldn't keep out, began to creep in around the edges. His hair thinned before its time. Her hands, once steady, began to tremble when she poured her coffee. The town had long stopped speaking of them openly, but there were still glances, still the occasional stranger who came too close with too many questions. The first real crack appeared when he began spending more time in the shed out back. Neighbors said they saw him there late into the night, light spilling from the small window, the sound of hammering carrying across the field. When asked, he'd only say he was fixing something, but never explained what. She didn't ask either, or maybe she already knew. Then, one winter, she fell ill again. This time, there was no recovery. Weeks passed where she didn't leave the bed, her voice growing quieter, her eyes unfocused. He stayed beside her as before, feeding her, reading to her, sleeping in a chair so he could wake at the sound of her breath. But now, there was something different in the way he looked at her, not just fear of loss, but a strange, hollow readiness. When she died, no one from the town attended the funeral. It wasn't even clear who had prepared the arrangements. There was no pastor, no hymns, just a casket lowered into the frozen earth while he stood alone, head bowed, the cold wind tugging at his coat. Afterward, he disappeared from sight. The house remained, its curtains drawn, its door never opening to visitors. Some swore they saw him leave town one night with nothing but a suitcase. Others claimed he still lived inside, tending to the empty rooms as if she might walk back in at any moment. Years later, when the property was finally sold off, the new owners found something in the shed, a wooden chest locked tight with a single photograph inside. It showed the two of them on the courthouse steps, her hand gripping his arm, both of them staring into the camera with the same unreadable expression. On the back, in her handwriting, were just 3 words: "Forever, my boy." Some stories fade with time. This one didn't. It lingered, passed from one generation to the next, stripped of dates and names until it became less a record and more a warning. Parents told it to their children when they wanted to teach the dangers of loneliness or the way love can rot if left unchecked. In the retelling, the details shifted. Some swore the son had run away. Others claimed he stayed and was found dead in the same bed years later, clutching her dress like a relic. But beneath every version, the same truth remained. What happened between them was not born in a single moment. It was built, piece by piece, in the quiet, in the spaces no one bothered to look. It was born of absence, of a missing father, a broken childhood, a life where the outside world was always kept at arm's length. And once that seed was planted, it grew in the dark, twisting into something no one dared pull into the light. If you go to that town now, the house is gone. The land is just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds that sway in the wind like they're keeping secrets. But ask the right person in the right bar, and you'll hear the story in a low voice, as though speaking it too loudly might wake something best left sleeping. They'll tell you about the boy who became a husband, the mother who became a bride, and how the two of them carved out a place where the rest of the world could not follow. They'll say love can be a blessing, but in the wrong hands, it can be a prison. And if you listen closely, you might notice the way the teller looks over their shoulder, as if the story isn't finished, as if endings are just something we make up to help us sleep at night. Because maybe, just maybe, some bonds never break. Not with distance, not with death, not with time. And somewhere, in the quiet places we refuse to look, there are others just like them, waiting to be found. Would you like me to also create a video description and title SEO package for this script so it's ready for upload? That would make it fully optimized for your audience.